7. The Bounty Hunter. We've not yet pinpointed a motive. Atlanta Police Department spokesman. By the time the sun came up in California, leaving Scott King face to face with the news about Misty and Hack, Tremaine Kiki Graham was calling him for the second time that morning. And in true Kiki fashion, he had a plan. Kiki told Scott that he'd come up with an idea that would immediately throw investigators off his trail. Never mind, Scott thought, that it was he, Scott King, who'd now look like the prime suspect, seeing as how he was on the run, and how Hack had been his co-defendant too. Kiki would create the illusion that, as a result of the double shooting on Highland Avenue, he was in grave danger. He would prompt law enforcement to believe he needed protection. He would let everyone know that he now had to fear for his life. It was widely known that Kiki was under house arrest at his and his wife Kai's East Cobb home. That meant that if someone wanted to target him, or if he wanted people to think someone wanted to target him, he'd be easy to find. So to demonstrate just how serious the situation was, Kiki made a temporary move to a place where any would-be attacker would be loath to tread. He sought refuge at the home of his mother-in-law, Atlanta Mayor Shirley Franklin. No one, including the mayor herself, would believe for a second that Kiki had the gall to move into her house if he'd been tied in any way to the murders. Surprisingly, the double homicide didn't make much of a public splash. 2 days after the early morning shooting, the deaths warranted a mere 100 words in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, buried deep inside the newspaper's Metro section. The paper quoted an Atlanta Police Department spokesman who described the killings as baffling, but not quite out of the ordinary. "We have no suspect, no motive, and no arrest at this time. It was a home invasion, but we've not yet pinpointed a motive." The story did not mention that one of the victims had been the co-defendant of the mayor's son-in-law. Apparently satisfied with the public reaction to the killings, Kiki later moved back to East Cobb, and for a time all resumed to normal, or at least some semblance of it. With Kiki still under house arrest, his friend Eric Mookie Rivera continued to meet with him at his house, and to plan more trips from L.A. during which he could traffic cocaine on Kiki's behalf. During one of Mookie's visits, in the fall of 2004, he asked Kiki how his case was going. "It's looking good right now," Kiki told him. "What's going on?" Mookie asked. "The one guy that could say anything about me got murdered," Kiki said casually, as if citing some obscure case law that worked to his advantage. "The guy's gone." At that point, Mookie didn't want to hear anymore, and for a while, he didn't. He'd be seeing a lot more of Kiki, though. On October 29, 2004, 4 days before jury selection was scheduled to begin in Kiki's federal drug trial, his attorney requested that Kiki be allowed to leave his home to attend a meeting. The meeting would take place at the attorney's downtown law office, a 30-minute drive from East Cobb. The attorney and client had much to discuss in preparation of the trial. The attorney thought an exception to Kiki's house arrest was warranted. As such, the request to the U.S. Probation Office was granted. But the meeting never happened. After Kiki left his house that day, he made a run for it. He cut off his electric ankle monitor and hit the road. Ernest Watkins, his associate with the inside man at UPS, rented him a car. From the highway, driving west from Georgia toward Texas, Kiki called Scott. He told him that he was going to catch a plane from Dallas to Burbank, and that he'd need a ride once he landed in California. Scott said he'd be waiting. Sure enough, Kiki took a cab from Burbank to Van Nuys, at which point Scott picked him up and brought him to his place. The following day, they met with their boss J-Rock, who offered to put Kiki up at the stash house way out in the burbs, the one on Oso Avenue called Third Base. As long as Kiki didn't mind keeping the company of several hundred kilos of cocaine and a veritable arsenal of guns, the arrangement would work out just fine. More than a week passed before the bonding company that had sprung Kiki found out that he was now a fugitive. Free at Last didn't get a call from the U.S. Marshal Service, or from any government agency for that matter. Instead, one of its employees happened to be watching the local news. Had the employee been reading the newspaper instead, Free at Last would still be in the dark. The story of Kiki's flight didn't even make the paper. The newscaster was saying that the mayor of Atlanta's son-in-law had skipped bond on major drug trafficking charges and was on the lam. That meant the bonding company, because it hadn't secured any real collateral on the bond, such as Kai and Kiki's home, stood a good chance of losing $300,000 should Kiki remain a fugitive. Back when the bond was posted, Kai Franklin Graham entered a contract with Free at Last stating she'd pay the full $300,000 in the event that her husband was to flee. But wrenching that kind of money from someone was sure to initiate a lengthy and costly legal battle. And despite the fact that Kai had provided the bonding company with a financial statement outlining her ability to repay the bond in the event of a situation like this, that didn't mean she actually had the money. In fact, her father's airport concessions business, where she'd been employed for 10 years, had tanked. She didn't even have a job. Free at Last didn't want to count on Kai to come up with the money she owed, nor did the company want to leave the task of finding Kiki up to the law enforcement alone. So, Free at Last owners decided to take matters into their own hands. They hired an Atlanta bounty hunter, Gene Guy, to track down any possible leads that could result in the apprehension and arrest of Tremaine Kiki Graham. Kiki was willing to turn his back on many things: his trial on federal cocaine charges, his home and his business, his third of $1 million bond, and his reputation as a repentant former drug dealer who feared for his life. But there were other things Kiki couldn't give up. He refused to abandon his young son, born 4 years earlier of a previous relationship, and he could not cut all ties to his wife. Whether or not Kiki maintained contact with Kai would be a subject of dispute. Scott would later claim that Kiki and Kai spoke regularly on a prepaid cell that was dubbed the Kai phone, an allegation Kai vigorously denied. Scott said he spent enough time with Kiki over at the Oso Avenue stash house to conclude that Kiki had certain obligations to his wife that he intended to uphold, including helping her pay the $5,000 monthly mortgage on their home. According to Scott, Kiki figured out a way to funnel cash to Kai, after which she would have to be careful how she handled it. The wife of a federal fugitive couldn't just deposit tens of thousands of dollars, origin undocumented, into her bank account, not without attracting attention. Scott also claimed that Kiki needed to send money to Kai for the 2 Porsche SUVs that were in her name, the ones that Kiki had given to Terry Flannery as a return on his 404 Motorsports investment. It wouldn't be wise to default on those loans. That could put Terry at risk, and Kiki had enough trouble as it was. According to Scott, Terry might even have spoken with J-Rock about the murders of Misty and Hack. The way Scott described it, a version of events allegedly relayed to him by Kiki, who Scott claimed had witnessed a meeting, J-Rock stopped by the White House sometime after the killings. During the visit, J-Rock allegedly boasted to Terry that there was nothing to worry about with Hack anymore. J-Rock told Terry that he had took care of it, Scott claimed. Now that Kiki was out in California with debts mounting back home, he needed to rake in some cash. The obvious way to accomplish that was to do what he'd always done best. Unfortunately, Ernest Watkins, who was integral to Kiki's UPS scheme, had called it quits. Ernest was beginning to think that Kiki was the only one who was ever going to get rich off that plan. It just wasn't worth it to him anymore. Ernest's complaint was nearly identical to Kiki's grievance a few months earlier, that J-Rock was seeing the windfall of everyone else's hard work. Kiki and Scott's fallback plan was to transport the drugs out east, and the drug proceeds back west, using private jets. For that, Scott and Kiki needed Mookie, who'd already proved himself highly capable of the task. And Mookie was more than game. In fact, he needed Kiki as much as Kiki needed him. A few days after Kiki cut his ankle bracelet and fled, Mookie suffered a falling out with J-Rock. It started when Mookie helped arrange a deal by which J-Rock gave one of Mookie's acquaintances $30,000 for a couple of cars. But the cars never materialized, and J-Rock held Mookie responsible. Mookie got the feeling that J-Rock wanted the guy killed, and that Mookie should be the one to off him. Mookie wasn't interested in that, though. He knew that killing the guy would come back to him one way or another. So he kept avoiding the situation until, finally, J-Rock told Mookie that he'd waited too long. Mookie was forced out of J-Rock's crew, and now he owed J-Rock the $30,000. Kiki witnessed J-Rock's excommunication of Mookie, and since Mookie already had been running drug money for Kiki on the sly, they figured they might as well make it official. Mookie would work for Kiki, and Kiki would pay him well enough that he'd eventually be able to pay J-Rock back. Over the next several months, Mookie flew on private jets back and forth from L.A. to Atlanta, no less than a half a dozen times. He ran multiple kilos of cocaine on the outgoing flight and tens of thousands of dollars on the return, but that wasn't all. Mookie also would drive some of the drugs up to Greenville from Atlanta and collect payment for them. And while he was in Atlanta, Mookie would deliver some of the cocaine proceeds to Kiki's wife. During his first trip after Kiki became a fugitive, Mookie flew to Atlanta, then drove to Greenville to pick up $50,000 that was owed Kiki for a past drug deal. Mookie would later claim that he counted the cash, divided it in half, and dropped off $25,000 for Kai. According to Mookie, Kai wasn't home at the time that he showed up, so using the garage door code that Kiki had given him, he went inside the house and left the cash on the stairs. Mookie then taped the other $25,000 to his leg, wrapped an ace bandage around it, and flew back to California on a commercial jet. The second time Mookie allegedly delivered cash to Kai, Kiki had him give it to her directly, Mookie would later claim. He would describe how he flew to Atlanta, checked into a hotel, and packed a bag with $20,000 in neatly bundled bills. Kiki then called him and said Kai was on her way to the hotel. Mookie, still on the phone with Kiki, walked down to the lobby and stepped out to the hotel's circular driveway. Mookie would allege that Kai promptly pulled up in her Lincoln Navigator. He claimed that he dropped the money-stuffed bag onto the passenger seat of Kai's car, and she drove off. Back in L.A., Mookie and Kiki were arranging yet another drug flight when, in the course of the conversation, Kiki mentioned that he missed his little boy. He asked if, this time around, Mookie would be willing to transport the child as well. Mookie said sure. Mookie would later claim that on that trip, after dropping off the cocaine he'd hauled from L.A. and collecting the payment, he met Kai in the parking lot of the Cheesecake Factory restaurant, where she handed over Kiki's son. Mookie took the boy with him to a private airport in Atlanta. He loaded the child and the cash onto the plane and accompanied them to L.A. On the flight, he played a Disney DVD for the boy to occupy him. During the child's visit, Scott stopped by the house on Oso Avenue to see Kiki. He was concerned to find Kiki's son there. He told Kiki that he needed to tighten up. "You can't let the authorities track you through your son," Scott warned him. But Kiki was careful. When it came time for the boy to return home, he allegedly had Mookie escort the child again. This time, however, Mookie and the little boy weren't in the presence of any drug money. In fact, they took a commercial flight, occupying 2 first-class seats on the red eye. Mookie even flew under an alias, Gary Rich. After landing in Atlanta, Mookie would later claim he and the boy took a car service directly to Kai's house, where he handed the child over to her. He then got back in the car, returned to the airport, and flew straight back to L.A. If Kiki was drawing attention to himself this way, so be it. There's no point being free if it means cutting all ties to the people you love. And anyway, he'd gotten this far without getting caught. Who knew if he ever would? For J-Rock, keeping up with his family was far easier. Inside first base, the 3-story house that sat atop a steep L.A. hill, J-Rock lived with his new wife, Tiffany Gloucester, their newborn son, another 2 sons, one from each of their previous relationships, and J-Rock's niece and nephew. To help care for all the children, J-Rock employed a live-in nanny who drove them to and from school, the Communion Christian Academy of the Arts and Sciences. The nanny also helped them with their homework and tutored them on the weekends. Things were looking good for J-Rock. His family was happy, his drug business was humming. Even his record label, Bogard Music, was making strides. Bogard had recently signed a manufacturing and distribution deal with WEA Urban, a subsidiary of Warner Music Group. That meant J-Rock's artists, Ooh Wee Chief among them, would be better equipped to sell their albums to a wide national audience. What's more, J-Rock, at least in connection to the fugitives Scott and Kiki, wasn't really on the Fed's radar. But DEA agents were poking around, not more than 3 blocks away. Over at Terry's stash house, the one called The Jump, Terry's crew had assembled one night with a plan. Celebrate the boss's 35th birthday. It was early January 2005, and Terry's entourage, which included his trusted Detroit manager, Arnold A.R. Boyd, and his second-in-command, Eric Slim Bivens, was getting ready to head to a club where a big party was planned. As they were leaving, though, A.R. noticed something unusual. The home security cameras, which were tucked away in the bushes surrounding the house, were registering a bunch of activity. It looked as if a team of law enforcement officers was scurrying about. He couldn't be sure, but there was no point in hanging around to find out. The crew booked it out of there and headed to the club. The party was well underway when, all of a sudden, people started scattering. AR thought someone might have been shot, but it wasn't that. It was the feds. They swarmed the party, and they brought Terry's festivities to an abrupt end. The crew, including Terry, made it out into their cars and took off. Rattled, but at least not arrested. That night, Terry's crew lay low and, for the most part, steered clear of the jump. One of them, though, headed back to the house, just around the corner from J-Rock, to see if it was safe. He quickly realized that the home had been raided, probably during the party. DEA agents had left the signed warrant inside, listing all the items that had been confiscated. A few drug ledgers from the exercise room, a money counter from the master bedroom, and, from the bedroom's closet, a black duffel bag stuffed with roughly $600,000. It was the ultimate fuck you to Terry, a raid perfectly timed to what would have been a day of celebration. Feds didn't have enough to haul him in, not yet. But with each wiretapped call, of which Terry was still clueless, with each confiscated notebook, there had been others before these pulled from the White House, and each haul of cash, the latest at $600,000, wasn't exactly chump change. The case the feds were assembling grew stronger. On January 24, 2005, 1 month after Kai and Kiki's third wedding anniversary, Kai Franklin Graham filed for divorce. The divorce papers stated that her husband's whereabouts had been unknown to her since he went on the run in November 2004, and that she has no manner of contacting him. The grounds for the divorce, the papers claims, was abandonment. A week later, the owners of Free at Last, the bonding company, were growing frantic. If Kiki truly was that far gone, they were in trouble. In Free at Last's experience, 95% of the clients show up at court as expected. The remaining 5% almost always were caught within 120 days. Kiki was pushing 90. And at over $300,000, his bond far exceeded the norm. The bounty hunter the company had hired, Gene Guy, had turned up a couple of leads, including information that suggested Kiki had rented a Ferrari through an accomplice. But Guy wasn't exactly close to tracking down Kiki, or, for that matter, the Ferrari. 3 days before a February 9, 2005 court hearing, during which Free at Last stood a fair chance of being ordered to pay the $300,000 bond in full, the company offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to Kiki's capture. Earlier that week, incidentally, an anonymous donor offered the same reward for information leading to a conviction in the murders of Misty and Hack. Free at Last also began to publicly pressure the mayor to take action. The company wanted her to hold her daughter accountable for the debt. "She's the matriarch of the family," Jennifer Green, the company co-owners, told the AJC. "I would want the mayor to be a mother and encourage her daughter to do what's right." After the February 9th hearing, Free at Last's situation was looking even more grim. The company was ordered to pay the court $50,000 by the end of the month and $30,000 per month every month thereafter until Graham was captured, or the $300,000 was paid in full. The company, however, still had a binding contract by which they might recover that money from Kai, and Free at Last had every intention of wresting that money from her. Yet that would prove even more difficult than previously imagined. A week after Free at Last made its first $50,000 payment, Kai filed for bankruptcy, citing the looming burden of having to pay for the bond her husband skipped out on, as well as the expense of the 2 Porsches that were in her name. In court papers, she admitted that she'd been a straw purchaser for the Porsches. She stated that she signed the paperwork on the vehicles to help her husband, and she never saw the pair of $100,000 cars, nor had any idea where they might be. The bankruptcy filing also described how Kai's estranged husband took all the couple's portable assets with him, including most of Kai's diamond jewelry. His whereabouts, the filing said, are still unknown. The suggestion was that Kai was destitute. As for Kai's belongings, she claimed to have $250 on hand, $200 in checking, $1,000 in savings, $1,000 worth of clothes, and $10,000 in jewelry. She stated that she was subsisting on a $2,000 monthly handout from her parents, an amount that wouldn't even cover half her mortgage. Now, Free at Last faced more pressure than ever to capture Kiki. If Kai's bankruptcy was approved and if Kiki wasn't caught, the small family-run company would have a hard time recovering from the $300 hit. The day after Kai initiated bankruptcy proceedings, Free at last took what it believed was the next logical step, and perhaps its last gasp. Jean Guy was a fine investigator, but considering what was at stake, Free at last needed to up the ante. The company hired Rolando Betancourt, who was considered one of the best bounty hunters in the country. His fee was $45,000 plus expenses, and Free at last was willing to make that investment. As soon as Free at last handed over the Kiki file to Rolando, on March 8, 2005, he went to work. The most promising lead was the 2004 Ferrari Spider that Kiki supposedly was driving. Chase Manhattan was the lien holder on the vehicle, which had been leased in California. The last payment had been made on January 25, 2005. Rolando's first stop was Kiki's last known address, the East Cobb home that he shared with Kai. At the very least, Rolando wanted to check out the vehicles that were coming and going, but all he saw was Kai's Lincoln Navigator. Rolando talked to the neighbors. No one had seen anything like a Ferrari. 3 days later, Rolando got a call from Free at Last's attorney. She told him that the Ferrari was registered to an address in Sylmar, California. Running a check on the address, Rolando found that the income levels in the neighborhood weren't exactly consistent with the $150,000 Italian sports cars. Rolando's next stop was Greenville, South Carolina. He met with Deputy U.S. Marshal John Bridge, who gave him a full briefing of the government's attempts to track down both Kiki and Scott King. John Bridges' investigation thus far had revealed that Kiki and Scott might be in Las Vegas or L.A. Both men had traveled there frequently in the past, booking trips through an agency called Outbound Travel out of San Leandro, California. He also mentioned that Scott and Kiki had ties to several NBA players and were acquainted with Charles Barkley and Michael Jordan, the latter of whom already had been interviewed by the U.S. Marshal Service. During a second meeting with John Bridge, Rolando was told that the phone number listed in connection to the Ferrari, like Outbound Travel, also had a San Leandro address. The number no longer was in service, but that didn't matter. Rolando had heard enough to convince him that a trip to California was in order. He boarded a flight to L.A. the following morning. Once he landed, Rolando immediately headed to the address listed on the Ferrari's registration, a down-and-out apartment complex in the thick of the San Fernando Valley. The property manager said that the woman who lived in the apartment drove a Ford pickup, not a Ferrari. He also told Rolando that her rent was subsidized, meaning she had to provide him with bank statements. And it just so happened that the apartment manager recalled some strange activity on one of those statements from back in November 2004. During that month, and mere days after Kiki went on the run, the woman's bank statement included several airline tickets, a bunch of prepaid cell phones, and the deposit of a $6,000 check. Later that day, Rolando watched as the woman and a young child walked out of her apartment and took off in the Ford truck. Rolando tried to keep up with her, but lost the tail somewhere in Pacoima. Before the day was over, Rolando stopped by a post office in the valley where a money order had been issued back in December to make a payment on the Ferrari. He chatted up the clerk who had issued the money order, and she said that she remembered the man who purchased it. Rolando showed her a picture of Kiki. "Yep," she said, "that's him." Another clerk piped up that she had seen Kiki in the post office even more recently, definitely within the past month. Rolando then stopped by another post office that had issued a money order used to make a Ferrari payment. The clerk there said that both Scott and Kiki were frequent customers. She remembered them well. After all, two men standing 6'5" and dressed to the nines are hard to forget. 10 days passed before Rolando caught his next big break. He went back to the apartment complex in Sylmar to try his luck again with the woman who drove the pickup. This time, she emerged from her apartment, climbed into the Ford, and took off. Rolando followed her as she wound through several side streets toward Ventura Boulevard. He lost her in a neighborhood just south of Ventura, and then caught up with her again. Rolando glimpsed her pickup pulling out of a long winding driveway on Libet Avenue. The driveway led to a 3-story house with a 3-car garage and a pool. There was a silver Infiniti SUV and a pair of black and white Land Rovers parked outside. Little did Rolando know that he had just stumbled upon J-Rock's first base. 2 days later, Rolando went to talk to the manager of the dealership where the Ferrari had been leased. He would have gone sooner, but the manager had been out of town. Rolando asked who had put the money down for the Ferrari, because surely it couldn't have been the woman whose name was on the lease. The manager said no, it wasn't her. Rather, a man named Eric Rivera had written the $92,000 down payment check. Rolando passed Mookie's info on to Deputy U.S. Marshal John Bridge back in Greenville. The following day, Rolando hit up Outbound Travel. The owner, who explained that his company was the exclusive travel agency of the NBA, said he knew Scott and Kiki and had booked tickets for them in the past, but it had been a year since their last trip. He also said that he heard from Charles Barkley that the two men were now fugitives. Over the next month, Rolando pursued whatever seemingly small lead that had been left dangling. He subpoenaed bank records that would show who'd written the $6,000 check that the woman from the Silmar apartment complex had deposited back in November. He learned that the woman's cell phone records showed she'd been traveling on a regular basis between California and Atlanta. He discovered that the silver Infiniti parked in the driveway of the house on Livet Avenue a few days back was registered to Eric Mookie Rivera's sister. He obtained a picture of Mookie, a mugshot from a past arrest out of Miami. Mookie's bond file listed a Beverly Hills address. Rolando checked out the address, which was a mail drop. An employee there recognized the photo of Mookie, but the P.O. box itself was registered to a woman who lived in an apartment on Riverton Avenue in Studio City. Rolando went there too and talked to the apartment manager. The manager didn't recognize Mookie's photo, but Rolando, just to be safe, handed him his card and said if Mookie happened to come by, please give him a call. What Rolando really needed, though, was to figure out how to keep a closer watch on the Livet Avenue house. It belonged, on paper, to a Massachusetts man who had purchased it the year before for $1.8 million. But something wasn't adding up. Rolando called Deputy Marshal John Bridge on May 13, 2005, and told him that he wanted to put together a high-tech system of surveillance cameras that could keep an eye on Livet in real time. That way, Rolando could watch the house from any location at any hour, from several angles simultaneously. The equipment, he said, would take 3 weeks to assemble, but he felt it would be worth it. Every clue was pointing toward the three men, Kiki, Scott, and Mookie, hovering around the same part of L.A., and the multi-million-dollar home on Livet seemed to be the hub. The house also appeared to be consistent with the drug kingpin's pad. There were fancy cars out front, and not-so-fancy cars, including the Silmar woman's pickup, were regularly stopping by. There was, on paper, an out-of-state owner, and that owner didn't live there. There also was the physical layout of the property itself. The house, like so many other drug lord domiciles, was very, very hard to surveil. John Bridge told Rolando he'd do whatever he could to help. Unbeknownst to him, however, the answer to the Livet Avenue mystery was practically right in front of him. The man who actually lived in the Livet house was, at that very moment, in Atlanta on business, and had been questioned 2 days before by Bridges' fellow marshals. In fact, J-Rock and some of his associates had landed themselves in a rather treacherous confrontation with both the U.S. Marshal Service and the local police. For the past 8 months, a federal manhunt had been underway for a St. Louis fugitive named Duran Wani Gatling. Wani, or Magic as he was also known, was a leader of a mid-sized BMF hub in Missouri, and thanks to an aggressive investigation in that city, several mid-level BMF members, Wani included, had been indicted in federal court back in September. The indictment had brought much grief to Yogi, who had complained about it to Amari during one of their many wiretapped conversations. Finally, on May 11, 2005, U.S. Marshals got a tip that Wani was hiding out at his girlfriend's house in a northeast Atlanta suburb called Chamblee. Shortly after 2 p.m. that afternoon, a team of marshals pulled up to the house on Anastasia Lane and knocked on the door. The man who answered wouldn't let the marshals inside. Instead, he said he'd speak with the homeowner, and he turned around and headed upstairs. He didn't return despite the marshals' repeated knocking. The team then split up. A few of them walked around back to see what they might find. Behind the house, they peeked through a window and saw 4 men in the basement. The marshals called for the men to come outside. They did, and as they opened the door, a strong scent of marijuana followed them. The men then insisted to the marshals that they were the only people in the house. At that point, the team out front decided to head inside the home. At the top of the stairs, the man who'd answered the door reappeared. and contradicted the men who just emerged from the basement. From the landing, he told the marshals that the homeowner, Wani's girlfriend, was the only other person inside. Investigators called for her, and she, too, appeared at the top of the stairway. "There's no one else here," she claimed. The marshals decided to check it out for themselves. As they headed up the stairs and down the hallway, they noticed a .45 lying in the master bedroom. From there, they climbed into the attic, where they noticed footprints in the insulation and noises coming from the far corner. Behind the wall paneling, hidden beneath a layer of insulation, the marshals found their fugitive. Wani was finally in custody. But the sting didn't end there. After discovering Wani, the marshals called DeKalb County Police for backup. Several units pulled up to Anastasia Lane, and as the DeKalb officers walked around back to meet the other team of marshals that was still gathered there, bullets started whizzing by. At least 7 rounds were fired from somewhere beyond the fence at the edge of the property. The bullets struck the house within feet of where the officers and the marshals were standing. After pulling Wani from behind the insulation and then hearing the shots outside, the marshals grabbed his phone. They saw that he had dialed a number while he was hidden back there, not long before the shooting started. The marshals asked him who he called. "An uncle in St. Louis," Wani said. "What's your uncle's name?" they asked. He wouldn't answer. Investigators quickly pulled Wani's phone records and saw that he dialed a local cell phone. And the phone, according to cell phone tower mapping technology, was located not in St. Louis, but in a neighboring Atlanta suburb, Dunwoody. The agents were able to determine that the number Wani called immediately called the third number, a cell phone that the technology revealed had been drifting around downtown Atlanta. And as soon as that third number got the call, both phones, that one and the one Wani himself had called, started moving toward the house on Anastasia Lane, the cell towers giving their locations away. In fact, both cell phones were in the immediate vicinity of the house on Anastasia Lane at the exact moment when the agents were fired upon. Not long after, both cell phones returned to the Dunwoody location. The mapping technology was able to pinpoint the exact address. It was a house on Spalding Drive. Atlanta DEA agent Jack Harvey, who had immediately joined the investigation into who might have fired on the marshals, was familiar with the house. From his extensive research of the Black Mafia family, he knew the house was a BMF hangout. Shortly after midnight, investigators obtained a search warrant for the house. Before charging inside, however, they set up a surveillance operation to see who might be leaving the house. Less than an hour later, a gray Chrysler 300 fell into the trap. The Chrysler was pulled over. The driver, Michael Playboy Harris, had been arrested 4 years earlier for the murder of Raul Rosales during the NBA All-Stars game in D.C. The charges, however, were later dropped. Jerry J. Rock Davis was in the Chrysler's passenger seat. The investigators confiscated both men's cell phones. They wanted to compare their numbers to the 2 numbers believed to be involved in the attack that afternoon. It turned out that the number Wani had called while hiding behind the insulation was J-Rock's. J-Rock told investigators that he and Playboy were temporarily staying at the Dunwoody house. He also admitted that he received Wani's distress call earlier that day, but he denied making any other call to assist his friend. After that, he shut his mouth. Once it became clear that they'd be coaxing no additional info from J-Rock or Playboy, investigators cuffed both men. By then, they had moved forward with the search warrant. The investigators forced their way through the front door of the house on Spalding Drive, only to find that there was no one inside. It seemed, however, that the occupants had just recently left, and that they left in a hurry. There were 6 cars in the driveway, an impossibly strong scent of weed in the living area, and guns and cash lying all over the place. One of those guns, ballistics tests would prove later, was the one used to fire on the marshals. And in one of the bedrooms, investigators found the cell phone that J-Rock had called after Wani called him, presumably to request the hit. While the search warrant was being carried out, investigators read J-Rock his rights, but there wasn't enough to hold him for good. They detained him for a total of 9 hours, after which he was not charged with any crime. The following morning, J-Rock was released.